Hey, what's up guys? Welcome back to another video, and today we'll be taking a look at the Mortal Kombat 3 ports. Before we start, let's look at some brief history of the game. Mortal Kombat 3 was originally released into arcades in April of 1995, and it was a commercial success. The game was later ported to the PlayStation, Super Nintendo, Genesis, Game Boy, and Game Gear in October of 1995. Sony paid Midway $12 million to make MK3 a timed exclusive on the PlayStation for the first 6 months, which is the reason why the Sega Saturn, 3DO, and Atari Jaguar versions were all slated to release in the second quarter of 1996. The Sega Saturn ended up getting Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 instead, and the 3DO and Jaguar versions were cancelled. Continuing a tradition of simultaneous home version releases from the first 2 games in the series, it was announced that the Super Nintendo, Genesis, Game Boy, and Game Gear versions would all be released on Mortal Friday, October 13th, 1995. However, the Super Nintendo and Genesis versions were the only versions that made the planned date. The Game Boy version was released a month later, and the Game Gear version was never released in North America, and it was only released in Europe. The publishing for the 16-bit console ports and handheld versions in North America were handled by Williams Entertainment rather than Acclaim Entertainment, who handled the console ports of the previous titles, although Acclaim still published the ports for Mortal Kombat 3 in the PAL regions. Versions for the MS-DOS and Windows 95 were released a year later. I think I rambled on long enough with history. Let's get into the ports of Mortal Kombat 3. We're gonna be starting with the PlayStation version since that was released first. The PlayStation version of Mortal Kombat 3 was developed by Williams Entertainment and published by Sony Computer Entertainment, and it's a pretty good port for an early PlayStation game. The graphics look really close to the arcade version. The sound in this version is in stereo compared to the arcade's mono only. The controls are really responsive and they don't feel laggy or unresponsive. There's even a secret character called Smoke that you can unlock with the special code after the game over screen. The PlayStation version of MK3 is a very solid port so far, but there is some issues that keeps it from being arcade perfect. The sprites for the characters are a tiny bit smaller than the arcade version. It's barely noticeable here compared to the 16-bit consoles. The announcer, or Shao Kahn, no longer says the round numbers during a fight. The issues I just mentioned are only minor problems. The major flaw with the PS1 version of Mortal Kombat 3 is the load times. The load times can be really long in between matches, and yes, I know this is an early PlayStation game and I know I shouldn't go too hard on it. The load times only become a huge issue when you're playing as Shang Tsung. The game would have to load every time you do one of his morphs. Shang Tsung's morphs are automatically disabled when you're playing versus against the computer. This proved to be an obvious limitation of the PlayStation hardware because this was no problem on the 16-bit consoles. Besides from the complaints, the PlayStation version is a decent port. It's not arcade perfect by any means, but it's still a good way to experience Mortal Kombat 3. Now let's move on to the Super Nintendo port. The Super Nintendo port was developed by Sculptured Software and published by Williams Entertainment, and it's accurate to the arcade version, only it's not. The level soundtrack doesn't change when you go to the other part of the stage, just like in all the other versions. Shiva has a completely different voice on the Super Nintendo. She has a normal female voice rather than a kind of male-sounding voice. The only stage that got cut out of this version is the graveyard stage, although it was shown in early promo shots of the game. The sprites were also smaller than the arcade version, similar to the last game on SNES. The controls are also very responsive, and it plays really well, just like the arcade version. The sound is pretty good for the most part, besides from the voice samples being way more compressed than the previous game. Besides the issues, Mortal Kombat 3 for the Super Nintendo is a decent port, but it's not as good as the Mortal Kombat 2 port. The game is still fun nonetheless. Moving on to the Genesis port. The Genesis version was published by Williams Entertainment and developed by Sculptured Software this time around instead of Probe, who did the first two Mortal Kombat ports on Genesis. So far, the title screen doesn't look that good, and the options menu music sounds terrible. So far, first impressions aren't too good. Once you start playing, the gameplay actually isn't that bad. There's obviously less colors on screen due to the smaller color palette on the Genesis hardware. The graphics look pretty good for Sega Genesis standards. The music doesn't sound that bad either. The voice samples don't sound that great, but that's something to expect on the Genesis hardware. The sound effects don't sound that bad either. The animation for the characters are pretty good, but I kinda prefer the SNES animations. They managed to fit everything from the arcade onto a 32 megabit Genesis cartridge. Every stage is here, including the graveyard level, which was missing on Super Nintendo. The soundtrack changes when you go onto a different part of the stage. All the stages look really good for the Genesis. All in all, the Genesis version of Mortal Kombat 3 is a very decent port, and it's a lot more accurate to the arcade than the Super Nintendo, and I think I prefer the Genesis version more than the Super Nintendo port. Don't flame me in the comments, please. Let's move on to the MS-DOS port. The MS-DOS port of Mortal Kombat 3 was published by GT Interactive and developed by Sculptured Software, and this is probably the best port of MK3. There's no load time since the game is installed onto the hard drive. The character sprites are big just like the arcade version, all the characters and levels are included, the game controls well, and it sounds great. All in all, the MS-DOS version of Mortal Kombat 3 is a very flawless port, and I would totally recommend giving it a try. There's also a version that was released on Windows 95, which is just a direct port of the PlayStation version with the same menus, character sprites, qualities, and gameplay. I'm not done with MK3 ports yet. I'm going to briefly mention the 8-bit ports of MK3 that were released on the Game Boy, Game Gear, and Master System. I've already talked about the terrible Game Gear and Master System ports in my Forgotten Mortal Kombat ports video. We all know that the Game Gear and Master System versions are bad, so bad, but they won't be talked about here. I've also already covered the Game Boy version in my Mortal Kombat for Game Boy video, but I feel like I can cover it a little bit better. The Game Boy port of Mortal Kombat 3 was developed by Software Creations and published by Williams Entertainment. It's definitely a step down compared to the Mortal Kombat 2 port from a year prior because this version is not very good. There's only 9 of the original 15 fighters available to play as. There's only 5 stages in the game, there's no button link combos, and no finishers outside of fatalities and babalities. Shao Kahn uses his moves from Mortal Kombat 2, and Motaro is not included. The controls feel very unresponsive, but it's not as bad as the first Mortal Kombat on Game Boy or Mortal Kombat 3 on Master System. This is also the only original Game Boy game that I know of that was rated M for mature by the ESRB. This version does not include much of the overt gore or violence seen in its parent systems, but kept some of the burning fatalities. Shao Kahn has a fatality that is exclusive to this version. He just hits the opponent with his hammer and they fall over. All in all, the Game Boy version of MK3 is a very shitty port, and it's definitely a step down compared to the amazing Mortal Kombat 2 port. At least it's better than the Game Gear and Master System port. I think this is the only time I will be saying that on this channel. Let's get on to the rankings. Now, here are the rankings for all the ports of Mortal Kombat 3. Coming in at number 7 for the worst port of Mortal Kombat 3 is the Sega Master System version. It's really no surprise that this one was coming. The music sounds terrible and it's unplayable. Coming in at number 6 for the second worst is the Game Gear version. A little more playable than the Master System version, but it's still really bad. Coming in at number 5 is the Game Boy version. Not as bad as the Game Gear or Master System version, but it's still a shitty port. Coming in at number 4 is the Super Nintendo port. This was tough to do. The Super Nintendo version looks and sounds better than the Genesis version, but it's missing some content and it's not really accurate to the arcade version. It's still a decent port nonetheless. Coming in at number 3 is the Genesis port. It's crazy how Sculptured Software managed to fit everything from the arcade version onto a Genesis cartridge, and they did a way better job than Probe Software. Coming in at number 2 for the second best is the PlayStation version. It's a really good port for the PlayStation. It's not arcade perfect by any means, but it's way better than the 16-bit ports. Finally, coming in at number 1 for the best Mortal Kombat 3 port is the MS-DOS port. It's easily the best home version of Mortal Kombat 3. It plays and sounds great, and there's no load times unlike the PlayStation version. It's the best port of Mortal Kombat 3 and I would totally recommend it. I'm not done yet. I'm going to discuss how Mortal Kombat 3 caused the beginning of the end for the franchise. There's a couple reasons why Mortal Kombat 3 caused the beginning of the end for the Mortal Kombat franchise. One of the reasons is the game itself. Don't get me wrong, MK3 is still a good game, but it's nowhere near as good as the first two games. There's things that I like and don't like about this game. I really like the stages, even if they're in odd places, and I like the Cyber Ninjas. They were a good addition to the franchise. The combo system and run button were good additions to the series. The main thing I did not like about this game was they removed some of the classic fighters from the game and replaced them with some new characters. Sonya Blade and Kano return after being absent from the character roster in Mortal Kombat 2. If you were used to playing as Raiden, Johnny Cage, Scorpion, Reptile, or Katana, you would have to learn a new character because they were removed from the character roster in MK3 and replaced by new characters. Some of the characters were removed because some of the original actors from the first two games, including Daniel Pesina and a couple other actors, left midway due to royalty disputes over the use of their likenesses on the console versions of the first two games. The characters who returned from the previous games were portrayed by new actors. I liked the new designs for most characters, but I didn't really like the new design for Sub-Zero. It just looked off seeing Sub-Zero without his mask off, and it didn't look good. Some of the new characters, in my opinion, just didn't feel right for Mortal Kombat. Let's take good old Curtis Stryker, for example. Throughout the series, we had 4-armed Shulkins, a Shapeshifter, a Thunder God, Cyber Ninjas, and now a Riot Control Officer. I would say the main thing that caused the beginning of the end of Mortal Kombat was the massive ad campaign for Mortal Kombat 3.
All major player and trade publications will be bombarded with
In 1994 and 1995, the special codes for Mortal Kombat 3 would pop up in magazines, flash on the screen during commercials, and they would pop up in Bally Midway pinball tables. It was given the world record for the largest promotional campaign for a video game in the 2011 Guinness World Records Gamers Edition. The ad promotion was kind of obnoxious and it was inescapable. It got even worse if you weren't already tired of hearing about Mortal Kombat 3 by the end of 1995. The codes appeared in the Mortal Friday ad campaign for the 16-bit console ports, and it made you even more aware of Mortal Kombat 3. The console ports came out a full 6 months after the arcade version in October of 1995. This infuriated arcade operators because the cabinet revenue for MK3 started to plummet after the home versions came out. In November of 1995, in order to appease the arcade operators, Midway sent out free conversion kits to convert any MK3 cabinet into Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3. The game added new stages, some of the characters that got removed from MK3, including Scorpion, Reptile, and Katana, were added back to the game. Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 also fixed some of the balance issues from vanilla MK3. This update was released in November of 1995, so all of the console versions of MK3 became obsolete in less than a month after release. There was also the console-exclusive Mortal Kombat Trilogy, which combined everything from MK1, MK2, and UMK3 into one game. Despite all of the initial success, MK3 was not able to live up to its own hype, and Midway lost a bunch of its player base, both in arcades and at home. Mortal Kombat 4 flopped hard, ending the arcade era for the franchise in 1997. There were 2 terrible spin-offs released on the PlayStation and Nintendo 64. The series eventually regained some of its popularity with some entries on the 6th gen consoles. Then there were a few bumps in the road. Mortal Kombat 3 showed signs that Mortal Kombat's time in the spotlight was over. Then, in 2011, Mortal Kombat 9 was released and it saved the franchise. It was the reboot that the series desperately needed after some mediocre entries in the series. The franchise has been still going strong ever since the 2011 reboot. Well folks, that is the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed watching this, and this will be the last Mortal Kombat ranking video, but that doesn't mean it will be the last Mortal Kombat video. I plan on making more videos based off of the games, and I eventually plan on doing a review of the cartoon series Defenders of the Realm. I also plan on making more ranking videos based off of fighting games, or just any other game in general. But anyway, thank you guys for watching, comment, like, and subscribe, and I will see you later. Bye!